Great. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the latest in an ongoing series of talks hosted by the Loughborough University Nationalism Network. My name is Tom Bennett. I'm a doctoral researcher in the Geography Department at Loughborough, and it's a great pleasure to have Natalie Koch with us here this afternoon as a speaker. But before I properly introduce her, I'd just like to remind everyone to please turn off your microphones and cameras whilst Natalie is presenting. Natalie will talk for around 30 minutes, and when we open the floor to questions, please raise either a digital hand or open your camera to make yourself known if you wish to ask a question. I'll try and gather them in a small group before Natalie responds. This will just make things a bit more efficient and saves a bit of time in the long run that usually allows us to finish at our 5 p.m. finish time, sorry. So Natalie Koch is a professor of geography at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. She's a political geographer who works on geopolitics, authoritarianism, identity politics, and state power in hydrocarbon-rich countries, primarily in the Arabian Peninsula. Her talk today considers the diverse intersections between nationalism and the politics of authoritarianism. Natalie, thank you so much for being here. Over to you.
All right, so thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, and sorry for the slow time in getting logged in here. I will try to be efficient about it, and with that, I will start my recording now. Does this look all right to anybody? People with a microphone can.
Yes,
perfect.
You see the slides? Okay, great. So yes, as mentioned, I'll be speaking a bit about the interconnections between nationalism and the politics of authoritarianism, both topics which have been really some long-standing interests of mine. And what I want to basically just start with is a really quick theoretical framing. I'm more a person for the empirics, but a bit of the theory and how I am approaching authoritarianism is essentially to treat it not necessarily as a place, which is sort of a traditional approach to just categorizing whole swaths of territory under the label of being authoritarian or democratic, as you can see sort of from the images there on the bottom from one of these Freedom House reports. But rather to think about authoritarianism as a set of practices. And these are practices that specifically work through the logics of discipline rather than freedom. So a whole lot of Foucauldian writing that I'm really inspired by and thinking about this, which I will leave to the side there, but I'm happy to speak a bit more about these governmental logics if people are interested as we go. But you will sort of see as I go through my examples today, how and why these governing logics matter. All of this said, even though I am talking specifically about a set of practices, I'm still interested in how these practices manifest within certain contexts, including authoritarian, or what we would label as authoritarian states, which is essentially places where those practices prevail. So in categorizing authoritarian states and authoritarian regimes, I think we can think about them broadly. Of course, this is a heuristic, so summarizing quite a lot in very simple terms, but a difference between soft and hard authoritarian regimes. Soft authoritarian regimes are those that tend to use more of those governmental practices of persuasion. So even if they are working primarily through the logic of discipline, they are also trying to incorporate tactics that can persuade their general publics to support them, as opposed to hard authoritarian regimes, which tend to work more toward the end of coercion. And in my own research, I focus a lot on spectacle, and especially celebratory spectacle, which is more in the direction of soft authoritarian regimes. So that end of the spectrum is really where most of my research has focused. I think there's a lot to be said about hard authoritarian regimes, coercion, punitive spectacle within the broader literature on authoritarianism. But I've always felt that the sort of soft side of things and the celebratory spectacles are that they're not sufficiently understood or approached. So for that reason, I've really tried to spend much more of my academic career focusing on these sorts of questions. Also, just a final framing slide here. When I'm thinking about nationalism as a tool of different authoritarian regimes, it works in many different angles, and this is of course not an exhaustive list, but some of the ways that I tend to see this in my own research is that nationalism is a discourse and set of practices that can help to mobilize subjects to work toward those state-defined goals because of the way that authoritarian regimes are interested in getting popular support for different projects. Nationalism is one way that they can encourage people to do that, but allowing them to not necessarily feel that they are supporting the state or the authoritarian leaders who they may actually disagree with or not feel positively toward. Nationalism also can help in that broader sense then of creating a sense of community and participation, and that allows those subjects to work towards state-defined goals, but it is also a set of discursive repertoires that the state can also still kind of control and channel in particular ways. And I'll talk much more about that in the context of the Arabian Peninsula with the examples that I'll give today. And finally, I think you can also see some of these interconnections with that's creating this image of state benevolence, while it is actually fundamentally justifying the elite capture of state resources. So I will, again, come back to that through some very specific examples from the Arabian Peninsula. So I think my abstract mention, I might talk about Central Asia. I'm going to leave that aside, but I'm happy to, if people have questions, some of the connections with my earlier work on Central Asia. But today, what I really want to talk about is looking at how it is that you see some of these connections between authoritarianism and nationalism in the way that the Gulf states are trying to prepare for this sort of post-oil future. And there, I think we see a lot of different ways that this manifests, of using nationalism essentially to sort of reorganize, or as part of the broader effort to reorganize the Gulf political economy, which shifts away from this very simple mental map that people have about the Arabian Peninsula as essentially being reduced to the top commodity that the region exports, but rather trying to challenge that mental map. And in so doing, in trying to transform this image of the region and also properly diversify their economies, ruling governments are very interested to retain authoritarian state power. So nationalism is part of that approach that they have taken to addressing these concerns about how to actually reorganize the region. All right, so I want to go through this. I'm going to talk about basically just two examples today, one from the UAE and the second from Qatar. So I'll start with the UAE, and specifically what I've been thinking about here for quite a few years, what is essentially amounting to sort of greening of Emirati nationalism. So as many of you noticed, Dubai hosted the COP28 UN climate talks in 2023, so year before last. And one of the big themes, of course, in these COP negotiations is how to transition. And this is something that the Emirati hosts were very keen to promote, that positive image of the UAE as being a leader in this energy transition effort. Why would they want to participate in this sort of global discourse when in fact they are an oil state? They depend heavily on oil and really, frankly, have no interest in giving up their oil production. It is essentially, in my reading of it, a way to sort of claim and make this energy transition Emirati. And there are lots of different ways that you see that sort of nationalistic flag planting in and through the different projects that the Emiratis have been promoting related to the energy transition. So one of the broader trends that I've been tracking in the region for quite some time, in the UAE in particular, is this effort to shift away from what the sort of traditional contours of resource nationalism in the UAE as being tied to a pride in being an oil country. And I still think like there's a lot of people in the UAE today that are incredibly proud of the country's resource wealth and would be happy to work for ADNOC, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. Working in the oil sector is not as stigmatized as it is in parts of Europe and the US today, but that is, nonetheless a recognition that from state leaders that in order to justify a lot of these new initiatives that they have about the energy transition, they need to start to shift that nationalism, that resource nationalism, to a resource nationalism that also incorporates being green and sustainable. So this is something that you could see being introduced at, first of all, the Expo 2020 in Dubai with the sustainability pavilion here. Sustainability was one of the major themes in the World's Fair. And of course, the site, Expo City grounds, were where the COP was hosted the following year. So this general idea of trying to encourage economic diversification and the state of the sort of green economy reports that you get from an institution here from Dubai about promoting this idea that we are going to continue to wave our Emirati flag. We're just going to do that in a more diverse economic context. Has been a major effort there. In addition, some of the major trends that you sort of think of this, I've been thinking of this in terms of the top-down nationalisms of the Emirati state, has been a strong effort to sort of nativize this post-oil green nationalism. And the main way that you see this happening in the UAE today is by the sort of deification of Sheikh Zayed, who is already, the leading nationalist figure in the country as the supposed founding father of the country. So he's always sort of idolized as the national founding father. But he's also now, when you see any of this green rhetoric within the UAE, it almost always comes back to him in some way. And most often it is from this quote that he's sort of shown as being this original conservationist, somebody who always understood the importance of conserving the environment and really preserving that for succeeding generations. So his identity is very much bound up with this broader narrative about green nationalism within the UAE. And as you can see from this image as well, there's a Sheikh Zayed Sustainability Prize, a prize that is awarded every year at the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week events in his honor. You can also see how this sort of touches down in various ways. So the rhetoric about Sheikh Zayed is something that different people pick up in certain ways. So this is from one of these official state publications. This article comes out from 4 engineering students from Khalifa University, which is one of the UAE's universities. And in this article, ostensibly authored by these four young students, is essentially repeating exactly that standard line about Sheikh Zayed and his concern for sustainability, that they, as the youth, really value saving the planet, and that his sort of devotion to environmental protection inspires them. And so there's a very clear way here that this sort of personality cult around Sheikh Zayed gets packaged with this green nationalist storyline. And that is sort of something that these young people start to learn that they should be reproducing in this very particular way. But it's not just the citizen nationals who are reproducing this. So this is just an example from one of the talks I went to at the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week, where this was a speaker, I think he was coming from the Netherlands, from this Hydroloop company. And he's, essentially pitching his product, but at the same time, he still feels the need to flag his respect for Sheikh Zayed and the way that this sustainable vision is really sort of tied to his identity within the UAE. So foreigners are also getting in on this as they are tapping into and promoting these green nationalist storylines. So in the UAE, there's several different emirates. There is Abu Dhabi is the largest one, but the other really important emirate in terms of politics and political power within the government is Dubai. And Sheikh Zayed is sort of the single founding father. He's deceased. But there are different ruling families in each of the emirates, and the rulers in these different emirates may or may not have a kind of personality cult of their own. In the case of Dubai, there absolutely is a cult of personality built around Sheikh Mohammed, and he is also one of these figures. He's living, and within the UAE today, he is very active in claiming that green nationalist story for the UAE as well. But in so doing, he is also building his own personality cult and sort of manifesting himself as the main visionary behind, for example, here hosting Expo 2020 in Dubai, presiding over the sustainability pavilion there, and really pushing that. He's also the person, if you've seen big pictures of this really big solar park in Dubai, that is the solar park that has his name on it, the Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum Solar Park. And as you can see again from these images, his face, his icon is always attached to the symbols related to Dubai having this big fancy solar park. So in waving that flag, it is also sort of in his own image that he personally is trying to invest his authority with that green nationalist storyline. He also is very much interested in this idea, the theme of the future. It figures very prominently in much of the UAE today. And there's always going to be sort of quotes from him, just as I showed the repetition of those quotes from Sheikh Zayed. You see that repetition of quotes related to Sheikh Mohammed and thinking about sustainable futures and being able to not just imagine futures, but to go out and create those futures that is quite prominent in this green nationalist storyline today. That said, even as you have this sort of future focus, there's also always that sort of typical thread of nationalism that is forward-looking and backward-looking. So you'll have, okay, the stories about the future, lots of pictures of small children being waved as flags. They're waving flags, but I really think sometimes children are more the flags themselves. And here you have that story being advanced in 2023. The UAE is one of these countries that has like a thematic for every year. So 2023, because they were hosting COP, became the year of sustainability. And as it turns out, 2024 was as well. They decided to just extend it. We needed some more sustainability. And let's see, sorry, I got a notification here. That said, you also still have that backward-facing theme of the green nationalism here of looking back to the legacy of our ancestors. So in 2023, there's also UAE has a national day, which is their Independence Day, essentially. And for the 2023 National Day, or Union Day, they sort of rebranded it recently. They've really emphasized this idea of looking back to the sustainable legacies of our ancestors and really try to get this whole down-to-earth branding, as you can see sort of from the color scheme here, also the patterns of the Union Day images where it is very clearly trying to show that this is a sort of eco-friendly thematic, but also, you know, that's that fusion of the traditional Emirati nationalism with sustainability in this image. And when I say branding, I mean very specifically branding. Like there is a brand application guide for Union Day, which you could actually download if anybody's interested. I'm happy to send it along in case it's not online anymore. But there's a whole set of images that you are allowed to use when you are doing any advertisements, anything related to the holiday. You must follow these official brand guidelines. So it's very explicitly defined for people where, again, you can see that fusion of the sort of nationalist vision with the green nationalism here, but also the really strong authoritarian take on this. Nationalism can't be expressed in just any way that you feel like on today's Union Day. It must follow these brand guidelines. And here again, I think this is one of the interesting pieces of that connection between the sort of persuasive, positive, celebratory tactics, but nonetheless also very disciplinary in approaching this. And just coming back to these images and stories of coming from Sheikh Mohammed about building this new future for our children and this new model of development. This is also a very unitary figure who is articulating and defining what those desirable futures are for the children. And I think here we always sort of have to come back to that bigger question of whose ideal future is this? Is this Sheikh Mohammed's or is it the children's? And how is it that these children and that talk of the future is becoming part of that flag waving process? That the children themselves are not agentive here. Like they're not being asked what they want. They are just being treated as icons. And I think the questions about whose future is being sold in this are really quite important. And I don't really have time to go into this so much now, but I'm happy to come back to it later if people are interested. But I would say that there is a very specific vision of a tech-focused, capitalist vision of what Dubai's future is. And that is a kind of, boosterist, urban boosterist future that is really directly manifested in Dubai, where you have a very clear vision of those capitalist leanings of the Emirati state. So that's one of the examples that I'll give from the Gulf. Moving then to the case of Qatar, and being aware of the time, I will be, I think, a little bit quicker on the Qatar case here, where you can see many of the similar dynamics as in the UAE, albeit with a different flavor. What I do want to sort of focus on, though, that's different from the greening of UAE nationalism, which you see to an extent in Qatar, but not as strongly, is rather to think more from the side of these economic diversification efforts in the Gulf states, again, in response to imagining this sort of reconfiguration of the political economy of the Gulf in the post-oil era. And this is one where you can look at what's happening with the sovereign wealth funds. Here with the Qatar Investment Authority, it's the main, it's really the only sovereign wealth fund within Qatar, but it has the same sort of story about safeguarding or protecting or thinking about the future generations. And here it is sort of that safeguarding of the wealth of the nation for the future. So QIA sort of sits within this broader ecosystem of sovereign wealth funds across the Gulf states. I won't talk about all of these, but just to give you a sense of them. Within the UAE, there's quite a few just because different emirates have their own, but in most of the other Gulf states, they simply have one main sovereign wealth fund. So QIA was one of the earlier ones to get going and really start making it big with its holdings, but others like you surely, if you're in the UK, will have paid quite a bit of attention to the PIF, the Saudi fund, which has been trying to catch up and outdo the rivals in the region. But just looking at QIA's vision and what they are sort of investing in, they say that their purpose is to generate returns for our future stakeholders, which is, of course, here, a little wave some flags with some children, that the future stakeholders are the Qatari citizens. Non-citizens that comprise 90% plus of the country's population, they might get some residual benefits, but really the stakeholders are the Qatari citizens in particular. But you can see how they are investing in lots of different sectors. And they explicitly state that they are partnering with leading institutions from around the world to seek global growth opportunities. So this is a nationalist project about creating value for the state and future generations, but it is also one that is inherently global. The sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf states, they do actively invest domestically, but they're also quite interested in that foreign outreach. So some of QIA's main holdings within Qatar, this is in the logos that you've got up on the side here: QNB, the National Bank, Qatar Airways, Ooredoo, which is one of their telecom providers, Hassad, Qatar, Mawani is the port provider. These are all companies that are wholly owned by and controlled by QIA. So they're really concerned with creating value domestically. Much of their focus is domestic. Qatar Airways, I think you could debate on that. But there are other institutions, subsidiaries or companies that it owns outright, which have holdings internationally. So Qatar Holding is the owner of Harrods. They also have stake in Barclays, VW, Porsche, Hochtief, and Sainsbury. In these cases, they're a bit smaller holdings as opposed to Harrods. They own outright. Qatari DR, also from the UK context, you surely have, well, okay, maybe not surely, but I hope you might have heard of them by now. They own the Shard. They also acquired the East Village after the 2012 Olympics, which of course, you know, a bit of controversy, I hope, in the UK because this was publicly funded. They have a number of other holdings throughout the UK and internationally. And finally, QSI, Qatar Sports Investments, is a subsidiary of QIA. They are the company or sovereign wealth fund subsidiary that controls Paris Saint-Germain, which again, I assume many of you will have heard about already. So just a quick survey here of these, you get a sense that this is, well, there's a lot of the Qatar national flag color branded in here, but it is also a way that you can see how international this nationalist project is. But just to spend a little bit more time on sports, since this is a topic I've done quite a lot of research on over the years, just returning to the case of Qatar Sports Investments. Nasser Al Khalifi is the Qatari man who is in charge of QSI and has been a really prominent figure in the sports team. So he also controls BN Media, which has basically a huge media presence in the sports world. First, really in France, but it has expanded much beyond that since then. And of course, you all will have followed the FIFA World Cup, which was held in Qatar in 2022. And here with this particular event, you can see how much the involvement of these international companies becomes quite important. Okay, FIFA as a sports governing body, I think we might all pretty legitimately call it a company. There are a lot of actors who have serious financial stakes that are tied to getting funding from Qatar. Qatar Airways gave them one of the largest sponsor deals when they were given the World Cup. But Qatar Airways has also sponsored more recently Formula One, FC Bayern München. If anyone follows German football, they no longer are a sponsor for Bayern, but they have had that presence. So in this, again, the story of the Sovereign Wealth Fund is that they are building value for the future generations, but at the same time channeling quite a lot of that money overseas. Sometimes that is in the name of the nation. It's described as acceptable simply because they're achieving certain foreign policy goals of Qatar, of increasing its prestige, or in other cases, I think a lot of these sports deals are hiding, let's just say, certain backdoor deals, agreements between politicians that allow Qatari officials to advance their interests. But the Sovereign Wealth Fund is the channel through which they are making these deals and doing these kinds of arrangements. It's easy enough to demonize the people involved in this from the Qatari side, but I think it is really important in all of this to remember that there are a lot of people in Europe, for example, who are very happy for this Qatari money to come their way. So who really profits from this national branding, if we want to call it that, in the case of Qatar? Of course, I think a lot of people following the World Cup conclusion in Doha were, had strong opinions, let's say, about Sheikh Tamim putting the robe here. That this is something that many people will tend to focus on Sheikh Tamim here, but perhaps less so on the FIFA side of things. But in all of these cases, all of these men are benefiting from this arrangement. So it is of course something that has significantly strengthened the role of the Qatari royal family. I won't go into detail on the side here, but Sheikh Tamim, who is the current emir, he's pictured there on the top photograph with his father. They have a very strong hold on power within Qatar, and I don't think that this is deeply contested within the country. There's fights within and among certain family members, but a lot of these big efforts of the Qatari government to be involved and active internationally is something that they are incredibly proud of. And this is especially in the wake of what was called the blockade of Qatar that ran until January 2021. Gulf neighbors shut off any transit into the country, and this created really severe problems for the country. But people really rallied around Sheikh Tamim, and the way that he was able to, for example, continue and make sure that the FIFA World Cup went off without a hitch, that really solidified his way of being represented as a strong ruler, of somebody who was going to support the Qatari nation in the face of any kind of international challenge. So in this way, you see that it is actually quite, it has been quite effective for them. But beyond just the ruling family, you also see that the other profiteers come from those behind Doha's urban boosterism and those who are building stadiums here. There can be many different ways that local citizens, even if they're not in the royal family, they are going to profit immensely from a lot of these sort of sports investments, for example, because they have a justification to continue building these big projects in a place where any kind of development is going to yield outsized rewards for citizens only because of the property regime. Again, I'll leave that aside. If people have questions in Q&A, I'm happy to come back to that. In addition, this is not just citizens that are benefiting from that, but of course also many of these international entrepreneurs, the consultants that are very active across the region, the engineering companies, the architecture companies, the construction firms that are all very much active in promoting these kinds of events because they stand to profit so immensely, and in a way that they really don't have they don't have the possibility to get such rewards when they are working in their sort of home market. So going to Qatar is a place where they can get those outsized rewards. And for them, conveniently waving the Qatari flag is no problem. I think we all know that companies are often quite happy to do that. And like the case of Dubai here, I think you can sort of see how many of these developments are about that sort of elite consolidation of power within this urban landscape. And it is through this that you actually see a strong continuity between the sort of oil political economy of the state and the post-oil political economy. Whereas the oil-based political economy, many of the resource rents were being recycled right through the construction industry. And this whole idea of build, 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 that was absolutely standard in the oil era, and it continues to be in this post-oil era, where we have the sovereign wealth fund investing in all sorts of new projects and also hosting big new sporting events, building big new universities. All of these big cultural sites, they are framed as being post-oil, but they model exactly that same pattern of build. And in this way, the city and its landscape becomes also then part of and fused with that nationalist story of just this landscape. This is the West Bay here from a view from Doha. This urban skyline is a symbol of nationalism in Doha today, as I think you can see across many different cities, but especially in the Gulf states. Okay, so just coming back then to some final thoughts on this. I think in the terms of the post-oil nationalisms in the Gulf, one of the questions that I consistently have been coming back to is whose future are we talking about and who's really deciding? I think these kids who are at one of the Qatar National Day celebrations, I observed they're adorable and they're cute and people love to dress kids up. But there's also this way that in doing that, you are removing agency from those children who probably aren't prepared to decide what their future looks like, but they are nonetheless being sort of cast as characters on this bigger theme that the adults are, that they are deciding about those futures. Nationalism, I would say, is also the sort of essential logic of these authoritarian states that I've been looking at in the Gulf states, and what I've been thinking about more recently of coming back to this literature on authoritarian developmentalism. That authoritarian developmentalism also has this future focus, but it is also always articulated through the logic of preparing for a future of prosperity for the nation, and the nation is the target group for all of these kinds of projects, which again though are fundamentally authoritarian. And those opportunities that are given through these authoritarian developmentalist projects in this post-oil effort to remake the region are colonized or seized by not just the local elites, not just by the Emiratis or the Qataris or the Saudis or whatever else you're thinking about, but they are also being taken advantage of by the foreign elites. And these can be the consultants, the construction firm companies, the people within these football associations, etc. So this element is something, again, I think is really important not to lose sight of. So just coming back to these 3 points that I raised before, where you can see how these projects, both in the UAE and in Qatar, are working towards mobilizing people to feel proud about these new state-defined goals, and using nationalism as a way to encourage that sense, and also to feel part of this community, that we are modern, we are participating in creating our nation's modernity, but also doing so through very controlled channels. And finally, in doing this, creating this image of benevolence, while ultimately in different Gulf states, you have more variation in terms of their income, but in Qatar and the UAE, this is really a social stratification that is quite extreme, and you have this really strong elite capture of the state resources. So in all of this, nationalism sort of helps justify that organization of politics and social dynamics. And just again, to make that final point, that this includes foreign elites who are incredibly active in both Qatar and the UAE. About 90% of the population are non-citizens. And they are not just those poor workers that people often read about in the media, but they are often very well-paid, upper middle class individuals coming from abroad. So with that, I will close, and happy to take any questions that people might have. So thank you.
Thank you, Natalie.
Right.
That was excellent. A really interesting talk. Let's open the floor to questions. I guess just as a reminder, please open your cameras when you want to ask a question. I'll try and collect a few questions before Natalie goes ahead and answers them, if that's okay. It looks like we've got a few in the chat, but let's prioritize those spoken first. So, Marco, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Natalie. Yes, sorry, there's also some questions in the chat. Maybe Tom, you can maybe, because Michael has left, so maybe you can read Michael's question, and then Yuval, if he wants, he can open the camera and ask the question himself if he's still in the chat. Natalie, if I can, because obviously in the presentation, give it the limitation of the time, maybe at least for me, it didn't particularly came out in a clear sense. Is about the specifics of the authoritarian states. Because if I think about how states mobilize people, how they use the nation to create a sense of community, so all these kind of things, they are not specifics of any, particularly of the authoritarian state, typical of any state. So where you see the specificity, the specifics of the way that the authoritarian states mobilize nationalism compared to non-authoritarian states.
So should I answer, or should we wait for more questions?
If anyone else has a question, please let yourself be known. Otherwise, I'll quickly read out Michael's from the chat, and then we can go ahead and group those together. Okay, so Michael says, a question about sports washing. The assumption in the West seems to be that Arab states' growing involvement in sports is all about engaging Western audiences. An alternative perspective is that these efforts are rather aimed at regional or even national audiences. In other words, Saudi Arabia's sports washing is as much about nation building as it is about promoting itself to Western groups. Could you please comment on this? I'd also just like to tack on a quick question that sort of follows Michael's, if that's okay. Because I also wonder if there's a push tool either from above, from the authoritarian leaders or the leadership, or from below, from the citizens, appreciating that it's a small 10% group perhaps, that want to grow or even see the value in more grassroots or heritage sports within the Middle East. I'm sort of curious about whether there's any emphasis on that at all. Maybe you'd like to go ahead and answer those three first, and we'll see if anyone else has any questions.
Yeah, thanks. Marco, I don't know if I have a great answer for you. and I think this is in large part because I don't think that authoritarian regimes are so very different from democratic states in using and mobilizing nationalism. To some extent, yes, it matters. I think you can see this in the case of how there's official discourse about National Day celebrations within the UAE, and like I showed you the branding thing there. You wouldn't have something like that in a democratic state, but there are just these wider structures that are trying to control exactly all of the symbols of nationalism within the UAE and how they are used. And likewise, what you tend to have is a lot of self-censorship, for example, related to the National Day holidays or anything related to the sort of national project. Everybody knows what the official line is and should be. So Sheikh Zayed must always be praised. Everybody knows that. And so you don't even need to.
Sorry to interrupt you. It sounds very similar to what another person now in the US seems
exactly
to do. Exactly the praise. They should always be there. And the thank.
Precisely.
Be grateful.
Precisely. Yeah, precisely. And actually in that Spatializing Authoritarianism book cover that I showed at the beginning, my chapter in there is about the personality cult about Trump. And I think that you do have a really strong use of American nationalism to create that personality cult around Trump. But much of it is it doesn't need to be mandated from the top. It's the dynamic of following and wanting to be close to the inside and getting the rewards from being inside. And so many people sort of subscribe themselves to that and participate in perpetuating that discourse in just sort of automatically, if you will. It's a dynamic that autocratic leaders might set in motion, but they don't necessarily always need state institutions to do that. They can foster that in various ways. So yeah, I think this is exactly why I'm reluctant sometimes to say that there's something exceptional about how authoritarian states use nationalism, because there's very many similar patterns across the board. I think the other big thing, just to answer that about the from the example of like the sovereign wealth funds, Trump also wants to now start a sovereign wealth fund. The US has states within the US have sovereign wealth funds, but that's neither here nor there. In any case, when you have a handful of elites who can appoint the royal family members to control the sovereign wealth fund and to control all of those decisions, and who gets the benefits from that, that is something that is, I think, pretty unique to authoritarian states. And you can also see this with the way that Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia has been using the PIF in a way to take over formerly or partly independent companies. So he forces a buyout of certain companies such that his PIF can then control those companies and keep those people beholden to the state. So there are different ways that the sovereign wealth funds are able to exert that authoritarian power in ways that you might not see in democratic contexts. So some variations, but I wouldn't say radical differences.
Thank you.
So to the question about two questions about sports. Yeah, thank you. I'm of the direction where I'm not entirely convinced of the story about sports washing in general. I don't like to use the word, but also just this very simplistic idea that it is just about pleasing Western audiences. I think you could see this very clearly with Mohammed bin Salman's interview with Brett Baier on Fox News, where he talked about, yeah, if I'm being accused of doing sports washing and I get like 1.5 extra GDP from doing this, I don't care, I'm going to keep sports washing. Like that idea is showing to, I think, like in an article that I've written about this, I think he's really showing to the Saudi people that he's bold enough to push back against that Western sense. And so you do have this nationalist spirit that he's embodying by refusing that Western critique. But he is also, in doing this and in inviting all of these international sports events into Saudi Arabia, he's very much acknowledging making these gestures toward Saudi youth opinion. This is something he cares quite a lot about. Whether or not that's successful, I don't know. I was in Saudi in November, and I actually was surprised how resentful I felt that the general population was toward these big sporting events that many people felt that they were sort of excluded from. So it's a strategy, but is it really working and increasing this nationalist fervor? It's hard to say. And I think this maybe comes back to Marco's question, simply because in an authoritarian state, some of that public opinion is hard to follow, because people know in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE and in most of these countries, you can be arrested for things that you post on social media. So in that context, how do you think you should be responding, right? People know that that they are in an unsafe environment if they were to directly express their opinions. So does it work in terms of promoting that nationalist fervor? It's really hard to know sometimes. To Tom's question about heritage sports, it's always there. It's much smaller. I think you continue to see an interest in camel racing and in falconry to a lesser extent, but I think where a lot of these initiatives are more fundamentally coming from, to Michael's question, is elite interests. There's a capitalist profit motive that they're chasing. And that's really where you see the big events. FIFA World Cup going to Saudi in 2032, to Qatar in 22. even PIF's acquisition of Newcastle, there's an economic incentive that they are after, and that's what the globalized sport offers, but heritage sport does not necessarily offer. They like to do some of those projects to, again, sort of, there's this tension in the Gulf states about selling out too much to the West and remaining committed to your nationalist ideals. And the heritage sports investments, if you do these sort of tokenist things, it can allow those leaders to say, look, we haven't totally sold out to the West. We're still supporting our national identity through the heritage sports. Yeah, so, but it's mostly tokenism, I think.
And do you think, thank you, that's great. I guess through my knowledge of the sports that they host, such as the football, but also within cycling, or they have a lot of sponsorship deals within cycling, or by hosting boxing events, for example, there don't seem to be much representation within the sports people from Middle Eastern countries at that top level. So I assume they are funneling a lot of funding into growing their sportsmen and women at the same time as doing these, or is that sort of also not necessarily where the emphasis is?
That's really not where the emphasis is. And I think, like, I could feel this, as I said, when I was in Saudi most recently. I could feel this in the reaction that people had to the big international football stars coming to Saudi. They have really good football teams. Like Al Hilal was one of the best Saudi football clubs, but all of a sudden those Saudi players get sort of put down in the limelight when big new international stars come on and start taking these big salaries. So there is a little bit of a frustration with that from those people who are talented domestic athletes. But in terms of other activities like supporting women's sport, really none of it. They love to sponsor the WTA, but are they supporting Saudi tennis players? Not so much. That's really not a focus. There are some really small efforts here and there, often because the international associations are asking them to do that, but realistically there isn't a huge investment or I would say a legitimate interest in pushing that.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have any other questions? I'm happy to read Yuval's out.
Chat, yeah, by Yuval. I'm not sure whether Yuval is in the chat and wants to ask or you want to read.
I can go ahead and read. It looks like there's still part of it, but I'll go ahead. I know that for us as Western scholars, it's tempting to look at these nation branding efforts as green policies, as PR tricks, or if we are generous, as a way to sustain economies in the post-fossil fuels world. But is it possible that there is a level of authenticity to their claims for sustainability? The historic origins of many of the ruling elites in the Emirates is Bedouin tribes who have survived the harsh deserts in the regions for generations before oil was discovered, using sustainable tools to survive. I wonder if in these marketing efforts tap into the heritage, or do you see that UAE and other countries in the region like Saudi Arabia using the rhetoric of progress and innovation exclusively to construct technological utopia or dystopia? It looks like Eric also has a question, so let's take Eric's question first and then we can go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Natalie, for your interesting talk, and I really like your investigation. So the topics are really fascinating, and what I would like to ask is about the role of tourism. So there's a lot of interaction in your talk in between domestic and foreign audiences. So. And this is very direct in the case of tourism, and it also has a physical effect on, well, hotels and all kind of buildings constructed in Qatar and the Emirates. where this national identity also comes into play. And I can also imagine that it also has an effect on the population. So these countries are flooded by expats, by tourists, but also by a lot of guest workers. And so are there still spaces for themselves in a sense? And isn't there a kind of backlash to that as well? So maybe you could reflect on this topic.
Yeah, great, thanks. So I'm going to quickly answer Yuval's question first. In short, yes, absolutely. There is that. There is a validity to that sort of Bedouin heritage and having this conservationist ethic. The challenge with that, of course, is that the way Gulf societies are organized today, and they're all in the cities where you can't live in the way that those ancestors once lived. So there continues to be this idea that these cities need to build. And the more you build in places where all of the water comes from desalination, any new development requires a huge input of resources. This is simply impossible. So instead, they sort of use that more as the way to brand and justify further building, which I think is inherently problematic, but it is nonetheless part of that sort of post-oil future story that they're trying to take that techno solutionism. We can just engineer our way out of the climate crisis or whatever else it is. Eric, thank you for your question as well. I think the tourism theme is really important here, in large part because yes, that has been a focus of many of the different states. I'll just give the example of Doha because it's a bit simpler to understand what's happening there. You can see similar dynamics on the other Gulf states. Since the World Cup, Doha and its urban planners, as well as the state, Doha's really it's essentially the only real city in Qatar. They have tried to imagine how Doha could remain this city that is defined by sports. And so they've tried a lot of different initiatives. They'll host the youth games for FIFA. There's so many different sporting events that they're trying to bring to Doha. So they're trying to cast the city's brand as being an exceptional place for international sporting events and continue to build that through all sorts of different institutions. So they're very happy for the tourism that is attached to sports, but there's a few other channels that they're trying to do that. They absolutely want that tourism income, and they want to figure out a way to make it sustainable. So it's not just a one-off event. That's a major interest that they have. And I think this is also where you see the Gulf airlines like Qatar Airways, Emirates, Etihad. Tourism is a big focus of those efforts, and also why they sponsor so many foreign sports clubs. But that aside, to your question about the local population, the citizens benefit immensely from this system. And the main reason is that, I'll say, just put a front note to say that this is a little bit more complicated today, but in most cases, only citizens are allowed to own property. And so what that means is that if you are a citizen, you are standing to benefit immensely from bringing in a lot of foreigners who are forced to rent from you, who cannot own their own property, who cannot necessarily, in many cases still, even they can't own their own company outright. So the citizens are a minority, but by continuing to bring in more and more foreigners, that's more revenue for them. And so for this reason, there's not that much reluctance to have a large amount of foreigners. They see a profit from this. Of course, in various ways, you do have sort of urban segregation within Doha, where citizens will really only live, most of the citizens will have a compound. They interact very little with the foreigners, and they're more or less okay with that. Some people might be resentful, but for the most part, there's really not that sense. It's a similar story in the UAE, Saudi less so. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Natalie. I think that's time. It's now a few minutes past. So thanks once again. We really appreciate you taking time out to give this talk. It's really informative. The next LUNN talks are Eric Storm from Leiden University on the 30th of April, and Nassar Mir from the University of Glasgow on the 22nd of May. So please do join the email list if you want to be reminded of these events in the future. I hope everyone has a great evening or a day, depending on your time zone. So Natalie, thanks again. And yeah, see you all soon.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thank you.